Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. So this is going to be a big overview about fight, flight, or freeze and kind of how it works with your systems. It's very important to understand this, not just from a philosophical or concept perspective, but in a tangible and technical way, because it's going to impact, it should impact how you train and how you work through specific problems in the field of stress, because that's what disaster or catastrophe or this concept of the worst case scenario is. Now, I'm offering this both for my YouTube channel, Mike Glover Stories, because I know on my Mike Glover channel, people like to hear me do consolidated speaking engagements on things that are going on in the country, current events type stuff. But on this, I'm offering this, which is the same thing that I offer big picture for all my members on Patreon. Now, beyond this, if you want to become a Patreon member, you can. It's patreon.com/Mike Glover, where we get into the tactics, tips, and techniques that will benefit you in leaning forward. So I invest more of my time in teaching you guys. And we just did like a 3-day fast. We just did a whole bunch of stuff on observation and situational awareness. So this will bleed off into that. If you're interested, it's linked down below. So let's talk about fight or flight. I apologize because I got to get this Black Rifle coffee. I mean, if I don't, I'll literally pass out. I haven't been sleeping well. Let's talk about fight or flight. We've heard the concept, and I say concept because when you learn about fight or flight, you're not really taught the science of it and how that physiological disruption to your systems, like what's the task, what's the purpose, and then how do you mitigate or work through the things? When people typically hear the word fight, flight, or freeze, they assume it's a bad thing. And believe it or not, it's a really good thing, but if not understood properly, it could be a bad thing. Also, when we hear the concept fight, flight, or freeze, we typically associate it with a loss of control. And it's the feeling like you're driving your pickup truck on the highway and an elk presents itself. You swerve to avoid the elk, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I almost had a heart attack. And all of those neurological responses were actually the sympathetic shift from parasympathetic, the sympathetic shift in survival. All these mechanisms that are designed to save you. The problem with fight, flight, or freeze as it's understood now is nobody specifically goes into the tactics on how, one, to mitigate and control it. And I think most specifically and most importantly, how to train with it in mind. The analogy I like to use, because I teach a lot of people, law enforcement, military, and civilians over the years, how to shoot guns on flat ranges, is imagine you're in a scenario where you're shooting a gun on a flat range and it's 70 degrees, it's sunny, you're having a lot of fun, and you're doing a draw from your holster onto a target. And the target's a bad guy with a gun. Well, you, because you're having a good day, are shooting very well, and that feels good. You feel accomplished, and I use the joke that you high-five your buddies and you go to TGIF Fridays or Bennigan's. That entire experience is not a realistic correlation to what happens in combat or a gunfight or a worst-case scenario. Why? Well, because all of the neurological responses that you have not experienced during that process, because your heart rate's at 70 beats per minute because you had a cup of coffee or a Monster energy drink right before, you're comfortable. So you're training technically inside your comfort zone, which is an aspect of training, but is only one piece of the pie. And I would say in that particular space, it's maybe 1/5 of the overall pie. 1/5 is technical training, maybe even repetition training while comfortable. You're getting the reps in. You're exercising the reps to condition yourself. It is not an example or representation on how you're going to react in real life. We hear this saying we're not going to rise to the occasion. We're going to fall back to our level of training. And that's true. I think the overall problem that I've seen in training law enforcement, being in the military myself, going through training experiences where there wasn't induced stress, there's a huge problem, especially in civilian training. Now, in the military, we had this concept called crawl, walk, and run, a progressive concept that's meant to implement more stress, higher risk conditions to evolve your training. Because we don't want to start running, like doing a live fire exercise after we fast roped on top of a building during a hostage rescue out the gate. We want to do it dry with an air gun, with simunitions. We want to walk through the procedure and talk about it through a rehearsal. Then we want to walk and actually navigate it with targets. Then we want to run and we want to do the whole thing live. A lot of people have this misconcept or misunderstanding of the concept that special operators or people in the military are adrenaline junkies. Now, there's some truth to that because you do get adrenaline, you do get cortisol, you get norepinephrine, but you're controlled because you're conditioned for that stress. I made the analogy on Joe Rogan's podcast, and it was funny because I had an Air Force guy actually criticize me about it. He got pretty slammed in the comments about it because people who actually listened to the context understood what I was saying. But what I was saying is like, it's not dangerous to be a special operator. Statistically, when you look at the numbers, it actually isn't. Not because of the lack of volume of dangerous missions or dangerous training, but the skill set and the high amount of high intensity and stressful training that prepares you more for war versus, in this analogy on Rogan's podcast, I said, versus the example of being a cook in the Army where they tell you to get on a 50 cal and go do security for a convoy of vehicles providing food to an outbase, like a forward operating base in the middle of nowhere. That's more dangerous because the cook is not prepared for the combat. He got a quick 5-minute block of instruction on how to use the butterfly and recharge the M2 50 cal machine gun. But if you took an operator and put him on that, I touch this frequently. I've done a lot of training in this. And somebody in the comment section, actually when this Air Force guy was talking out of his butt, a guy said, it's like being a UFC fighter in a bar fight, right? You're better prepared, you're better trained, and so you should be able to control the dynamic, and you don't have to get crazy. You don't have to crack people over the head with bottles and get reckless. You can close the distance, gain control, and submit somebody or, more safely manage the situation. And so when it comes to fight or flight, one, we have to identify what is fight or flight. How can we harness that? And then what are some tools and tactics that we could become better at our training protocols to be prepared for war? That's the point. And in this discussion, I'm just going to cover what is fight or flight and freeze. And for the other subsequent discussions, you can check it out on my Patreon. This isn't a scheme to get and migrate you there. I just have a group that I communicate to because of their investment in me. And again, I'll link that down below. But I want to give you the big picture for everybody who's interested in listening. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put this on my main channel because I think it could be useful for a lot of people. All right, so what is fight, flight, or freeze? Now, I talk about this in my book, Prepared, in detail, give examples. One of the examples that I give is I was in a gunfight, my first gunfight in Afghanistan, and it was a 9-month rotation. It was a pretty bad rotation as far as the number of casualties, the danger, the threat to force. And during this rotation, I expected to be in a gunfight because in Special Forces selection and training in the Q course, we trained for small arms combat in the wood line with AR-15s, right? And I could walk you through all the battle drills because I was an infantryman prior to, infantryman that was Ranger qualified, airborne qualified before I became a Green Beret. And so as I migrated, I was like, oh, this is what it's about. This is warfare. And we did have scenarios where we had incoming from artillery, from mortars, from indirect fire capability. But I have never experienced the feeling of what it's like to be on the receiving end of a 107 millimeter rocket landing close to us. And I had several close calls. Me and my 18 Charlie, I was an 18 Bravo, a weapons specialist in our patrol base on one night, had gotten a mortar attack, and we were on the roof providing security with a 240 machine gun. I was the gunner, my 18 Charlie Lee, he was the spotter, when a 107 millimeter rocket went over us and impacted the ground and destroyed a building, where I went, oh my gosh, like this is the most vulnerable position you could be in. But why was I on the roof? Well, in my base defense plan that I created, the understanding was there was going to be an indirect attack, and the worst case scenario was a comprehensive or complex attack that included a direct attack on the ground. So despite the incoming rounds coming in, we had to be prepared for guys pouring through the wire. Well, when you're on top of a roof and mortars or 107 millimeter rockets, which is about this big, has a kill radius of a lot of meters, and sounds like a freight train, when you're on the receiving end of that and you're anywhere near it, you will become a casualty. So again, I'm prepared for the war here, not prepared for the war from above, okay? So in the example I used in Prepared, a manual for surviving worst case scenarios, which I'll link that down below as well, the concept was incoming fire, you do a battle drill, you seek cover, and you try to identify the point of origin. We call it the POO site, point of origin. Where's the POO? I'm looking for the POO, but it's very distracting to me that there's 107 millimeter rockets landing on the airfield or the helicopter landing zone that I'm hiding behind a vehicle on, and the vehicle is not going to stop anything. And I had a moment of panic because, again, I've trained for this, but I didn't train for the incoming round with a major kill radius. And so I had to talk myself through this because all my systems in fight or flight, from a parasympathetic rest and digest situation, which you're likely in right now, I'm in, even though I'm getting hopped up on Black Rifle coffee, I wasn't prepared for that. And all of these things started to happen. Cortisol, norepinephrine, this adrenaline started surging through my systems, blood shunting to primary muscle groups to be able to get me to move. And so fight. When we shift into sympathetic as a nervous response, our heart rate shoots through the roof. Our rate of respiration shoots through the roof. It's why people who get in fender benders get out and they're very excited, and also they're out of breath. It's why if you don't manage these things, which we'll talk about in the tactics at a later time, you're going to be more likely a victim because you can't manage the stress. Now remember, what we're talking about is the suppression of stress on top of us. And it doesn't have to be a 107 millimeter rocket, because if you're not conditioned for stress or you don't have a good baseline for stress, the stress could be a vehicle cutting you off in traffic, where you're gripping the steering wheel, road raging, and doing really silly stuff that you normally don't do. Like, I don't know, like accelerating to go get the guy who cut you off in traffic. And it's like, why would you do that? Well, that condition, your normal everyday condition, could be a great example and correlation to how you're going to react in this worst case scenario. And so I measure it in low grade stress versus high grade stress. A vehicle cutting you off in traffic should be low grade, but because our baseline isn't truly defined, because we're living in a first world country, our problems aren't the world's problems, and we're not used to that type of stress, then our baseline where we're supposed to be at a low grade, maybe we end up in a high grade. So if you got low grade and high grade and you shift it over, Well, when a worst case scenario happens where somebody draws a pistol on you at the middle of a gas station at 5 p.m. trying to steal your wallet in front of your family, well, you're going to be on the far right extremes of that, and you might not be prepared. And what typically happens is you get past this fight, you get past this flight or fleeing, and then you're in a freeze situation, nearly like shock. And that's because your system, when it goes into fight, flight, or freeze, is hyper aroused. Now, the tactic, which is part of your vagus nerve and can be measured through your vagal tone, which is the rate of respiration in conjunction with your heart rate, is the way that your physiological systems manage stress. But think about this. Your brain in a primitive scenario in fight or flight is a liability. Because if you're overthinking things and you're complicating things, then you're not able to utilize immediate action with your physical body. Because remember, fight, flight, or freeze, or the sympathetic nervous response, is the body's ancestral way of mobilizing your butt and getting out of harm's way or fighting out of harm's way. Okay? That's why it's called hyper arousal. Now, something not often discussed, and we'll get into this in later blocks of instruction, is what's called hypoarousal. Now, let's just talk about hyperarousal and the examples that I've seen. I've actually been involved intimately in it. One time I was doing a joint operation in 2006 with Navy SEALs, and we had Iraqis with us because we wanted a host nation force with us. At the time, I think we were using the Iraqi counterterrorism force, and we were doing a joint operation to go after a high-value target. I was one of the advisors or the assaulters that was managing some of the Iraqis, and we had, at the time I was a member of 3rd Group's Commander in Extremist Force, and so we had assaulters and snipers. I was attached to the snipers, and we had a group of Navy SEALs. I think it was like probably half of a platoon, maybe a dozen guys. So those guys had occupied a building, and I was out with one of the Iraqis searching and clearing a ditch right next to the building. As I'm clearing this ditch, I'm under NVGs, under night vision, so is the Iraqi, and I'm using an infrared laser floodlight to be able to illuminate the ditch so I obviously don't give away my position because this is a nighttime raid. As I'm doing that, the Iraqi accidentally illuminates the ditch with his white light, and I see it, and it illuminates and nearly blinds my vision. I see it, and I tell him to turn off the light. As soon as I go to tell him to turn off the light, we receive incoming PKM fire from a machine gun a couple houses away. So I immediately, because I'm inside the ditch, fall on my butt, and I open fire on the point of origin with my suppressed M4, and he goes down. At one point, I think he got shot because he falls into the fetal position. And so I continue to engage, and at the time that I engage, the Navy SEALs who are inside of this compound open up fire above us, which I felt safe. You know, Navy SEALs are decent shots. They shoot over our heads and towards this building. The vehicles that have guns, and some of my guys are on twin 240s and 50 cals, they open up fire on the building as well. So I know we have suppressive fire on the building. And so I call over the radio, hey, I'm going to try to move to the building, to you guys' position. But they're still shooting overhead of us. So I know I have to move with this Iraqi, and we need to stay low. Well, I go to grab him, and I realize he's not shot. He's in shock. Now, this is a guy who has lots of training, lots of combat, and he's not moving. He's in the freeze component, not deliberately because he's trying to avoid the enemy. A lot of people misunderstand the freeze component or fight or flight. The freeze component happens when you're in shock and you're incapable of moving. It's similar to a faint or feign response, which they don't want to move because their systems are shutting them down. Not to be confused with freezing because I want to avoid the enemy, which requires a lot of cognition. So in this process, the brain's shutting down because it doesn't want to make a lot of decisions. It wants to have fight or flight, but it's so overwhelmed. It's like the fainting goat that just freezes up and falls over. It's a survival mechanism. It's part of the hypoarousal segment. And you see it in deer or fawn. You see it in the animal kingdom when the predator's chasing the fawn, and the fawn, as a last-ditch effort, wants to survive. It collapses and falls over and plays dead. You can obviously see it because there's a saying, playing possum. Possums do it. They even secrete the smell of feces. They'll even urinate themselves, and they play dead. Why? Because as a primitive example, the apex predator doesn't want to risk eating tainted food that is going to kill it and its gene pool, so it avoids it. It will smell it. Oh, it smells disgusting. It might be full of bacteria or virus, and then it moves on. That's what this guy was in. He was hypo-aroused, not a deliberate tactic to freeze. And so I went to get him to move, and he couldn't move. So I have to drag this. Iraqis, at least commandos, are big dudes. This dude's like 160 to 80 pounds. I grab him and start dragging him across an open field about 25 yards into this compound. I get him against the wall. I check him for gunshots, and I slap him in the face. He comes to, and I'm like, dude, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, what happened? And he doesn't remember anything because he shut down. His systems as a mechanism of survival shut down. So the interesting thing here is, one, we need this dynamic. We need this infrastructure and this tactic of survival. You can't avoid it. Even a trained operator is going to experience it. The difference is when you're conditioned for this, you manage it. Being a free fall jump master, being to all the schools, advanced free fall, etc., and then having a free fall, military free fall sniper reconnaissance team, I've done lots of dangerous free fall training operations. I never jumped in combat, but we trained a lot for it. Standing on the ramp at 20,000 feet in an airplane with a 120-pound ruck between my legs, under NVGs, staring into darkness through green and black night vision goggles would make anybody adrenaline rushed and fearful. But when you're trained, you accept that surge, that elevation, and you harness it to utilize it for performance. That's what the difference is. So when they say, oh, you guys are adrenaline junkies, not really. Right? Not really. We're performance junkies, meaning we like the feeling, we harness it, and then we leverage it to benefit us. Because that elevation of cortisol and norepinephrine, we're going to utilize to advance our performance. Because at the same time things are happening, like blood shunting to primary muscle groups, it gives me more strength. So I need to maintain a balance where my brain physiologically wants to cut off because it's a liability. The cognition is a liability because I need to be quick and immediate. If I'm harnessing it, I'm staying cognitive. I'm working through problems. Because the detriment would be, let's say I jump out into 20,000 feet of space and I'm in free fall and I have a malfunction. If I'm not cognitive enough to be able to work through the decision-making of an emergency procedure, then I panic, I freeze, hypo-aroused, and potentially die. That's what happens all the time in training where people, the best example is when you watch like Pilot Debrief. I love that channel. If you haven't checked out that channel, check it out. He's a former Air Force pilot. But he talks about the panic that goes through pilots where most of the mistakes, I think it's 60+% of mistakes that are made that lead to casualties is not mechanical issues. It's the error of the pilot because they're not able to maintain their cool, calm, collected cognition. and then they do something or they don't do anything and it gets somebody or themselves killed. So you need to have a balance of both. You need to be able to think through problems, and you need to be able to manage that stress. And that's what it is. It's stress. It's the harnessing and management of stress. So the greatest example of this that I've communicated in training blocks is if you're doing a shooting sequence and you're shooting at targets because you rehearsed it. I don't know, let's say you're a grandmaster in USPSA. Well, in fact, here's a great example. We used to do this at Range 37. My buddy Mike Duskin, who ended up passing away, who was killed in combat, God rest his soul. Mike was a good dude. He used to run this Range 37 comp. And this competition included a lot of physical movement, a lot of stress, and then the shooting. And what we saw was when you had a professional shooter who was used to technically replicating or emulating and rehearsing what they were practicing during a USPSA match or an IPSC match, when they were implemented into a scenario where they didn't know exactly the target sets, they weren't able to practice and rehearse, and then they had to do physical movement, which replicates the stress with the elevation of heart rate, the elevation of cortisol. It balanced the playing field because operators or Green Berets or Rangers or whoever was competing, they were used to operating under stress. And so they weren't technically the most proficient at shooting, and the professional shooters could outshoot them. But what happened is it balanced the playing field where now the technical advantage the shooters had were tactically deficient because they weren't used to doing it through stress, whereby the operator that wasn't as technically proficient was physically fit and able to work through it. And then the balance typically managed itself. And you saw, I mean, I fared pretty well in the competitions that I shot in. I would typically place top 10 out of a lot of shooters. And I would bring my work guns and try to, train like I fight and use it as a training opportunity. And then you would see a couple of guys like Rakaza, JJ Rakaza, who's a great example of this, understands that and he trains for it, where now he's physically able to move through these scenarios where you have, no offense to Robbie Latham, but you got like a guy like Robbie who's a little heavy set, who's very used to technically operating here and moving the gun, where he wasn't faring so well. And I don't actually know if Robbie ran the comps. He wasn't there when I ran it. I had heard he had ran the comps. So with all that being said, the overall point is when something bad happens and you're taken by surprise, and you will be taken by surprise, if you're not trained and conditioned for that, you will go into fight or flight. It's the same feeling you get where you avoid an accident. You almost have an accident. You avoid the animal. You get back on the road and you're good. And then you feel that adrenaline surge. Well, that surge is the shift from para to sympathetic. And it includes I use the analogy of shoving up your butt, this surge of cortisol, the lack of cognition fading because it wants to use primal instincts. And the issue is, in a modern survival scenario, you need cognition. You need the ability to think through problems, and you need the ability to technically operate. So that's why, going back to the original point of this, if you're technically training, like drawing a holster and breaking a shot, that's one part of it. But can you do 100 burpees and then do that? Yeah, sure, but you'll be degraded. So the balance is training with the implementation of stress at the same time. And there are several ways that you could implement stress, which we'll talk about in the tactics block of this instruction. Lastly, let's just talk about the hypoarousal stage of this. Guys, this is not often discussed. And a lot of people who are trained for combat, I have seen, not a lot, I've seen it rarely happen, but a lot of people who have been trained have an expectation that they're going to rise to the occasion. And what I've seen in rare instances is operators like Green Berets, Rangers, name it. I have several examples of this, who have freezed under circumstances where you think they would rise to the occasion. They've fallen back to their level of training and then fallen back to their level of experience. And what I mean when I capture experience is this. You don't know how you're going to react under a worst case scenario until you've operated under a worst case scenario. But you could train for worst case scenarios that could help better prepare you for that. The missing component, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, is your experiences prior to even your training. Because what I've seen and experienced in multiple blocks of instruction and training is people who had hidden trauma tucked away in their closet, under their pillow, under their bed, in this back room in their house. Hidden trauma that they've never discussed and talked about come to the surface at the inappropriate time that we don't want it to happen because we want to survive, and that affect the outcome. Let me give you an example. Victims of sexual assault. It's known that victims of sexual assault, one, have not remembered exactly what happened. Why? That is a protective physiological mechanism of survival. Because where you would shoot 4K on your cell phone, you just chuck the 4K cell phone and you're shooting 8mm reeling through the film. Why? Because your body, your mind, your soul and spirit want to protect you through that survival mechanism. It's trying to protect you, and people talk about it. They say everything moved in slow motion. I was getting frames of information. And sexual assault victims, they won't even remember it. They'll repress it, suppress it. When asked, they said, I just don't remember. Another example, number two, is they will claim that it's their fault because they should have did something about it. They should have fought back. And they felt frozen in paralysis in their own body. That's not often discussed because paralysis is the hypoarousal tactic known as the fawn or faint or freeze response that is seen in many examples in the animal kingdom and in active shooting scenarios. Virginia Tech is a great example. In Virginia Tech, a student walks into a classroom, into a building that he locks behind, the doors behind him, and he goes room to room executing these students. 90+% of the students were killed by a shot from the back or side of their heads. Why is that impactful? Because every student in there, it's not they didn't have the warrior mindset. It's not that they didn't fight for their survival. It's the physiological system shut them down and flipped the switch because that was the mechanism physiologically they thought that was going to provide them the best chance of survival. If I play like I'm dead, I might survive. In one case that I mentioned in my book, as outlined in the book Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley, specifically, one of the students played dead. At one point when he went to move, after he wasn't shot, he thought he had been shot because his legs wouldn't move. Because not only is it a mind component, it's a body component. Chemicals rushed into his body to create paralysis to shut him down. When he went to move, he thought he was paralyzed because his legs wouldn't work. That's because this survival mechanism in the worst case scenario is the worst case scenario if you're not conditioned. Think about that, guys. You might not even know that you have a mechanism in you that shuts you down, which is why sexual assault victims blame themselves because they felt like they were frozen in their own body, because they were. Not just inside their heads, their body had a mechanism to enact that tactic. And so they blame themselves. There's nobody to blame because that was the conditioned response. And why is this so important in summary? Because if you think you're training good enough, you could have from your own personal experiences of things that you never discuss, never talk about, where you're hiding behind the car, fighting for your life. In the self-defense act, you're using all the tactics and you freeze and lock up and you can't do anything about it. There are plenty of examples on YouTube and officer-involved shootings and self-defense scenarios and even accidents where people lock up, they freeze, and they can't do anything about it because it's a mechanism in them to survive. That's why it's so important that we condition ourselves to fight through those moments. It's also why it's so important to be vulnerable and to talk about these things. Sure, like the technical aspects of drawing them from the holster, that's the easy part, guys. You could rehearse, you could practice, you can get through that. The unknown elements are the things that you need to work through, like being more vulnerable and communicating about those things in therapy, in a fireside chat, expressing those things, because if you harness them, you tuck them away, they might come out at the most inconvenient, worst case scenario and shut you down. That to me is the worst case scenario that nobody talks about, because it's not just your technical training capabilities. It's the trauma that you've lived with and harnessed, might have never discussed with anybody, that could send you into hypoarousal and freeze you and lock you up chemically, and you have no say-so in it. So yes, it's complicated, but there are tactics and techniques to work through it. All right, guys, like I said, this channel is not sponsored. I'm going to move on and migrate into the tactical and technical blocks to be able to build this protocol on my Patreon. It's linked down below. Hope you have a great weekend. Till next time, peace out.